Hello, my name is Vanessa Anderson from Waldorf University. This video is for my Physiological Psychology class where we are currently studying memory and communication and how it relates to brain structure, obviously with Physiological Psychology. For the purpose of ease in this presentation, I'd like to share that when I reference our book, I'm referring to our book, The Physiology of Behavior, 12th edition by Neil R. Carson and Melissa A. Brickett. So going forward, the aim in this video is to answer 3 questions, and they are as follows. 1. What are the structures and processes involved in, and how do they interact to produce memory? 2. Is this a cortical, sensory, or subcortical process, and what we say about environmental influences in the development of memory or the learning process? And 3, is communication mediated on a neurological level? So, start at number 1. What are the structures and processes involved, and how do they interact to produce memory? If you've taken a cognitive psych class, you probably already know a little bit about how memory works and the different parts to memory. But here's a little overview. Sensory memory is the first way in which information is taken in and processed. It is essentially the first feeling you get or associations with something that happens, and it just takes seconds. Short-term memory is different from this in the sense that it's the second stage of memory or your working memory. There is a TED Talk out there by Professor Peter Doolittle on working memory, and one of his points in this talk was that everyone has a different capacity for working memory. Some people have more of it than others. It's not a matter if you have a better memory than others or if you have different parts. Some people just have more of a capacity for it. Some people who have a larger capacity are usually good storytellers or comprehensive test takers. So people who maybe score higher on SCTs or ACTs or MCAs in school. Those people usually have larger working memory because once they can recall it and work with it, it comes back to them. Dr. Doolittle touched on many different ways in which we can practice supporting our working memory. One being that the more you use or rehearse, which is just like when we do in school, when we practice something or read it over and over until it becomes easier to recall or identify on a test. The more short bites of information get worked with, the longer it will stay in your long-term memory or for your working memory to use. Chunking is a way that we all kind of naturally try and work with something to memorize it. We do this pretty naturally when we use telephones, 3 numbers, 4 numbers. So usually if you can recall at least one of those chunks of numbers, you can recall most of the phone number. Mnemonic devices are also a way that we help our working memory pull things from our long-term memory. Long-term memory is the final stage of memory and is the most permanent of all memory processes and takes some of our short-term memories that are more rehearsed or chunked and used enough and can last several days, minutes, weeks, months, years. Off of that, declarative and non-declarative memory are 2 categories in long-term memory and differentiate by our consciousness as non-declarative memories are memories we not be fully aware of, whereas declarative memories are ones we recall and talk about often and usually are from more specific events and times. This can even be broken down further to episodic memories, events and experiences, and semantic memories, which is more facts and concepts. The structures or parts of the brain that are involved in learning are the amygdala, the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the thalamus and their receptors. And then how they communicate kind of gets into our next question. Question number 2. Is this a cortical, a sensory, or subcortical process? So meaning involving your cortex, brain cortex. And what can we say about environmental influence in the development of memory or the learning process? Well, in short, all the cortical, sensory, and subcortical processes all play a role in how memory and learning is done with the brain. Because structures needed are in different parts of the brain and involve processes such as classical and operant conditioning. Classical and operant conditioning probably sound familiar, again, from other psychology classes you've taken. Classical and operant conditioning play a part in how we learn. Classical conditioning is when, as our book says, an unimportant stimulus acquires the properties of an important one. Most people recognize this by Pavlov's dog experiments, or may be able to recall it once you hear about Pavlov's dogs, where he uses a bell to train his dogs to salivate with the sound of the bell due to ringing the bell before presenting his dogs with food, which then in turn made the dog salivate at the sound of the bell. Operant conditioning is different because it puts a consequence into play to keep or get rid of a behavior. Operant conditioning comes from someone operating a behavior, whereas classical conditioning engages a learning reflex behavior. Our environment influences playing a part in our learning and memory process because when we experience something that has a favorable outcome, we will tend to make that response again. So last question number 3. How is communication mediated on a neurological level? This sounds like is a really complicated question. Most of what we know about how the brain works in regard to communication comes from studying neurological communication disorders, or what is wrong with the brain before we can find out what's right. Aphasia is the inability to use or understand speech due to the brain damage from a stroke or a TBI, for example. Or amnesia is another brain injury that is studied, and that is when you obviously have trouble with your memory, like pieces of your long-term memory cannot be recalled. It takes both hemispheres of our brain to be able to use our language ability. The left helps with comprehension and production for most people, and the right plays a role in processing rhythm, stress of speech, and processing emotional content. Our book tells us that in order to produce language, one must have something to communicate that is happened in the past, or just imagined. Our occipital, temporal, and parietal lobes are what gives us lobes are what gives us the ability to perceive current events and memories in the Broca's area, which is in the left frontal lobe, and is what helps us control the muscles needed for speech. So me sitting here talking, and language production. The Wernicke's area in the left hemisphere is what helps us with comprehension of specific words, while comprehension of figurative speech or figurative language is on the right. There are many communication, language, and even reading and writing disorders that change how communication is mediated on a neurological level, and we are fortunate enough to have a lot of research and resources in this area for this. And all of that has helped us know as much about the brain as we do. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video, and I hope I was able to answer all these questions effectively.